Hey everyone, today I'll be exploring what it's like to be an individual, or more theoretically, a subject under capitalism, through the lens of psychoanalysis and critical theory, using the ideas of Slavoj Žižek and perhaps more importantly, Byung-Chul Han. So, when I've stated, and I admit provocatively, why you should give up on your dreams, I'm not talking about existential projects. Far from it. In fact, the tragedy of living under capitalism is that, in fact, very few people have existential projects, have vocations, things that existentially move them and drive them. Rather, most people have either jobs or careers for basic survival or for careerism. But a more apt title to explore subjectivity under capitalism would have been something like Why You Should Not Have to Have Dreams. Now, that would make a bad title. Therefore, I'm stating provocatively, perhaps even for the clickbait, why you should give up on your dreams. So, I'm not talking about having dreams, having existential projects, aspirations, ideals, none of that. Rather, to try and rid ourselves of the pressure to have the category of dreams, the category to achieve. And that connects to basically everything that I'll be exploring through mostly Byung-Chul Han's work in his book, The Burnout Society. The thesis I'll be arguing for is that because our society, and I mean that more in a cultural sense of our psychosocial reality, because society constantly berates us, or perhaps the better word is inundates us with this imposition to achieve, have dreams, have goals, have aspirations. We live in a society of toxic positivity that all of this commandments to achieve is in fact harming us and making us lesser humans. And theoretically, I'll be exploring this extreme harm done on human subjectivity using the concepts of burnout that Byung-Chul Han has outlined in this book, and then Slavoj Žižek's perhaps now rather famous idea that enjoy your superego in our times. So firstly, what is burnout as Byung-Chul Han explains it? Now we all know, I think at a colloquial level, what burnout is. Burnout is generally when you got a lot of work to do and you're tired and you're working really hard and then suddenly you just crash. You crash both physically and mentally, and you kind of feel depleted at a very even spiritual level. And generally, the way we treat burnout is as a purely mental health phenomena, to use a rather voguish word. But Byung-Chul Han, he outlines in this book that no, it is in fact something a lot more sociological. Individual burnout is a symptom of a deep-rooted or deep-seated malady in our culture, and it has to be analyzed at that level. So he states in the book, depression, ADHD, and burnout syndrome point to excess positivity. Burnout syndrome occurs when the ego overheats, which follows from too much of the same. It represents the massification of the positive. So we can immediately see that these so-called mental health conditions such as burnout syndrome, ADHD, or depression, for Byung-Chul Han, these aren't merely psychological phenomena. They can't be viewed as that. They have to be analyzed and theorized on different layers, or it has to be a multi-layered analysis, and that's exactly what we're going to try and do in this video, and perhaps focus more on what our culture does to us, rather than purely treating it as some kind of lifestyle issue or a mental health issue. And really the idea is quite simple, because the reason we see so much of excess depression, ADHD, burnout, whatever you may call it, it has very little to do with the individual. It has a lot more to do with our cultural reality, and it is because we are living in what he calls the achievement society. It perhaps is one of the best terms that Byung-Chul Han has coined, because it really captures all the ideas that we're going to explore in this video, the idea of the massification of the positive, toxic positivity, hyperactivity, and all of that. So here's another excerpt where he states, the late modern achievement subject is subject to no one. In fact, it is no longer a subject in the etymological sense, that is, subject to. it positivizes itself. Indeed, it liberates itself into a project. However, the change from subject to project does not make power or violence disappear. Autocompulsion, which presents itself as freedom, takes the place of allocompulsion. And in this case, allo means other, so compulsion by the other. And I believe it's pronounced allo. In any case, this development is closely connected to capitalist relations of production. Starting at a certain level of production, auto-exploitation is significantly more efficient and brings much greater returns than allo-exploitation, because the feeling of freedom attends it. Achievement society is the society of self-exploitation. Now, this is important. The achievement subject, that is you and I, exploits itself until it burns out. In the process, it develops autoaggression that often enough escalates into the violence of self-destruction. The project turns out to be a projectile that the achievement subject is aiming at itself. So as a leftist, I don't want to play the good old Marxist game of blaming everything on capitalism, although it is fair to argue that certainly achievement society is a product of capitalism. It's not just a plain materialistic economic product of capitalism. Of course, it's a lot more complex. The ideological web is a lot more complex, but capitalism has a lot to do with it, especially as to how we, as human subjects, start viewing ourselves as capital itself. So a society becomes an achievement society when there's an excess of positivity and there's an absence of negativity. Our society doesn't allow negativity anymore. Even negativity itself is turned around to made into something positive. Things like "The Obstacle is the Way," books such as that by people like Ryan Holiday. And then this line's quite important, isn't it? So in what I just read, it says here, it positivizes itself. Indeed, it liberates itself into a project. So this is the perfect example of how we see a lot of self-help, or let's call that health and wellness fanaticism. People are obsessed with turning themselves into a project and optimizing themselves into the best version of whatever they are. And this kind of self-optimization, or in the more capitalist sense, self-exploitation, that is, you become an entrepreneur of the self, you become a independent business owner, whatever you may call it, that becomes the end in itself. We start viewing ourselves as these sort of pure bare machines that have to be optimized, that have to be made the best version of itself, which, by the way, doesn't exist. But that's the point. The point is that we constantly want to get better. It's typical, American capitalism, but it's now a bit more, let's call it, harder to see on the surface, because it's a lot more holistic. It's capitalism with a good face, isn't it? It's new age stuff. It's reading self-help books, meditating, optimizing yourself. So again, it's not surprising that we see some of the best-selling books to be books on health and wellness, or self-help books, or books on personal finance, or the most listened to podcasts these days are all personal development, self-help podcasts, or more podcasts from like let's call it the Andrew Huberman lab model, where you got all these health and wellness tips and tricks on how to optimize your body. But in this kind of achievement culture, we are inevitably gonna fail, because it doesn't exist. The perfect version of yourself, or the optimized version of yourself, doesn't exist. It's a fantasy that we're chasing. And then it's gonna lead to burnout and depression and ADHD, because at one point, the ego gets burnt out by excess positivity, by excess, let's say, the excess demands to be the best version of itself. But I hope I'm not being misleading in the video by using terms such as self-exploitation, or auto-exploitation, or auto-compulsion, or auto-optimization. I'm not stating that this is something that you can blame the individual for. We can't just say, oh, take some responsibility, you figure it out on your own, learn to relax more, or don't exploit yourself. In fact, Byung-Chul Han is very clear in this book that is doing the analysis at a cultural level, which is why he calls it the Achievement Society, and that we need to focus this toxic positivity. It has to be viewed at a systemic level. He calls it the systemic violence that is imposed on human subjects living in such a social reality. But of course, as I stated, the symptoms are seen in individuals. So yes, at first we are misled into believing it's a purely individual issue, but then further analysis will show no, it has very little to do with the individual and a lot more to do with society and the culture that we live in. So in an achievement society, what makes an individual sick, what destroys and harms our human subjectivity, it's not restrictions, it's not an excess of responsibility like it would have been in a traditional society, where you'd have duty and whatnot. But in achievement society, it's rather the unyielding imperative to achieve. The new commandment of late modern society is that you can be the entrepreneur of yourself, you can do it, you can be the best version of yourself. And that's this unyielding imperative to achieve is what makes us sick and indeed makes us guilty if we don't achieve. And we eventually burn out. And this perfectly connects with to Žižek's idea that in our times, Freud is not dead. In fact, Freud is perhaps most pertinent to our times because the superego imperative, according to Žižek, is enjoy.
The traditional notion of psychoanalysis is that because of some inner obstacles, you internalized, identified excessively with paternal or other social prohibitions, you cannot set yourself free to enjoy, to pleasure is not accessible for you. It is accessible to you only in pathological forms of feeling guilty and so on. So then the idea is psychoanalysis allows you to suspend, overcome these internalized prohibitions so that it enables you to enjoy. The problem today is that the commandment of the ruling ideology is enjoy in different ways. It can be sexual enjoyment, consumption, commodity enjoyment, up to spiritual enjoyment, realize yourself, whatever. And I think that the problem today is not how to get rid of your inhibitions and to be able to spontaneously enjoy. The problem is how to get rid of this injunction to enjoy.
So I've discussed this idea by Žižek in many of my videos. The reason being I do think it's one of his most important insights in his cultural analysis. And I think it's important to connect that to many of the other theories by thinkers such as Byung-Chul Han. So in How to Read Lacan, Žižek states, superego is real, the cruel and insatiable agency that bombards me with impossible demands and then mocks my botched attempts to meet them. The agency in whose eyes I'm all the more guilty, the more I try to suppress my sinful strivings and meet its demands. For Lacan, superego has nothing to do with moral conscience as far as its most obligatory demands are concerned. Superego is, on the contrary, the anti-ethical agency, the stigmatization of our ethical betrayal. And in an achievement society, it's this superego imperative, the imperative to enjoy, that we can't achieve, that makes us feel guilty, leading to burnout. So Byung-Chul Han is right that ultimately where we all and all human subjects that partake in achievement society, and in a way we have no choice, is that we end in depression, ADHD, and burnout. But it's also because of this psychoanalytical reality that superego isn't what traditionally was thought of as being some kind of godly figure or a father figure telling us right from wrong. Rather, it's an anti-ethical agency that wants us to transgress, that wants us to, in a way, be these solipsistic, narcissistic individuals, and we, in fact, get tired of having to be ourselves. And maybe a much more deeper way to understand what an achievement society is by understanding what it's not, by juxtaposing it with a more traditional, what Foucault would call a disciplinary society. So Byung-Chul Han states, disciplinary society is a society of negativity. It is defined by the negativity of prohibition. So in this case, just to interrupt myself reading that there, that's a weird way to put it, this is, again, the superego coming in, but more in the prohibitive sense and telling us not to do certain things. And that would be in a more traditional disciplinary society. Back to the text. The negative modal verb that governs it is may not. By the same token, the negativity of compulsion adheres to should. Achievement society, more and more, is in the process of discarding negativity. Increasing deregulation is abolishing it. Unlimited can is a positive modal verb of achievement society. Its plural form, the affirmation, yes, we can, epitomizes achievement society's positive orientation. Prohibitions, commandments, and the law are replaced by projects, initiatives, and motivation. Disciplinary society is still governed by no. Its negativity produces madmen and criminals, the society Foucault analyzed. In contrast, achievement society creates depressives and losers. So here's where we could probably connect the superego with a disciplinary society and an achievement society. The superego, in many ways, I view it through the Kantian categorical imperative. To put it simply, in the philosophical sense, for Kant, the categorical imperative are these necessary, unconditioned principles that we must follow, leaving aside our desires. And in many ways, the superego acts in the same way. We always feel that we need to please the superego because it constantly haunts us. In disciplinary society, this may come in the form of the guilt of committing some kind of sin, maybe adultery or I don't know, whatever prohibitions that traditional society or disciplinary society had on you. Whereas in achievement society, we still have the same guilt. The superego doesn't go away, but the categorical imperative, let's say, takes a different form. Or the form remains, but takes a different content. Now it says, you must have initiatives. You must have projects. You must have dreams. You must dream. It's really important to have dreams and be the best version of yourself. And the same guilt that the subject under disciplinary society had for not pleasing the superego, that same guilt is experienced by all of us in achievement society. So here's where I kind of disagree with Byung-Chul Han, because he states that psychoanalysis in a way can't explain what it's like to be a human subject in achievement society. But I would argue, using Lacan and Žižek, that in fact we most certainly can, because it's through how the superego haunts us and bullies us that we can understand the burnout caused in human beings living in achievement society. As he states here, psychoanalysis presupposes the negativity of repression and negation. The unconscious and repression, Freud stresses, are correlative to the greatest extent. In contrast, the process of repression or negation play no role in contemporary psychic maladies, such as depression, burnout, and ADHD. Instead, they indicate an excess of positivity, that is, not negation so much as the inability to say no. They do not point to not being allowed to do anything, but, and this is really important, but to being able to do everything. Therefore, psychoanalysis offers no way of approaching these phenomena. Now, that part I disagree. I'll expand on that a bit later. Depression is not a consequence of repression that stems from instances of domination such as superego, nor does depression permit transference, which offers the indirect signs which has been repressed. He is right that the repression doesn't act in the same way for subjects in achievement society the way it would have done in the past, but rather, when we start viewing the superego not as an ethical agency like the categorical imperative per se, but rather as the anti-ethical agency, the way Lacan puts it, as that agency that bullies us when we don't fulfill the demands of our, let's say, high ideals, for a lack of a better term. It's that guilt in the same way that leads us to depression, ADHD, and burnout. The symptom is a bit different, but the cause is quite similar, at least in its form. So, leaving all theory aside, although I'm not saying that theory is not important, I'm not saying it's something detached and abstract. In fact, in our times, theory is most important to understand our existential reality. Why am I saying you should give up on your dreams? Of course, if it's not obvious already, I'm not saying having dreams is a bad thing or that you should feel guilty for having goals and aspirations. Certainly not. In fact, I would argue that in capitalist society, people are made feel guilty if whatever hobby, goals, or aspirations they have don't align with the capitalist modes of production. So, for instance, if you, let's say, have a knitting hobby, sometimes the question, or most times the question you would get is, oh, where's your Etsy? Where's your online store? Why haven't you made this into a business? Why haven't you become an entrepreneur of the self? If you haven't taken your hobby and converted it into a business, it's as if you're doing something wrong. You're made to feel guilty. So all of that is great. Not that you're made to feel guilty, but having hobbies, all of that is fantastic. But the point I'm trying to make is that the category of dreams, having to have dream or having to achieve things and always be your best version, that will destroy your subjectivity and make you a miserable person. I have no doubt about it. Generally, in theoretical texts, they aren't that prescriptive. They generally do a more of a cultural or sociocultural analysis or critique. So they aren't prescriptive. But in this video, I'm going to be prescriptive and say that if you don't have dreams, if you don't have goals, and if you just want to travel around and kind of be for the sake of being, that's fine. You don't have to feel guilty about it. That's okay. But the thing though is, if you bring in psychoanalysis, you inevitably are going to feel guilty. So we're kind of stuck here, but that's life. Life is kind of shitty at times. But at least knowing all this theory helps us to be somewhat self-aware and know where that guilt comes from when it does come. Hope that all made sense. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.